Please join me in welcoming Federal Communications Commission Chairman Ajit Pai. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to IPI for the invitation. Thanks as well to the Sumner Scholars and to the UT Dallas students who are here. I've got to say, you guys have got it much more together than I did when I was at your age. In that regard, I want to give a special shout out to my former high school debate partner, Jenny Bursick, who's in the back, along with her husband, Scott. She's been disseminating far and wide some of my aesthetic challenges in the 1980s. And so when I say you've got it more together than I did, she knows what I'm talking about. I really hope that all of you had a good Labor Day weekend, and I know that many of you are, of course, excited that it's opening day for the NFL, which I understand is a national holiday here in Dallas. Speaking of, my beloved Kansas City Chiefs will be playing tonight, and I sometimes refer to the Chiefs as America's team. And I have to admit, this often produces some quizzical looks or provokes vigorous and almost violent disagreement. But tonight, as you know, or might know, the Chiefs are going up against the New England Patriots. So for at least a few hours, the Chiefs will truly take up the mantle of America's team. If the Patriots are watching that, it was just a joke. So you never know, they might be watching. So. And after tonight's game, I'm here all week, guys, I'm here all week. Now, look, while I'd love to spend my time with you today sharing my thoughts about the upcoming NFL season and the upcoming Chiefs Super Bowl championship, for some reason, that's not why Tom kindly invited me here. So instead, I'm going to talk about a much more exciting topic: what the FCC is doing to promote innovation and investment in the internet economy. But before I do briefly need to address something that's on the front of my mind and something I dare say is probably on the front of many of yours, and that is Hurricane Harvey. While the damage is still being assessed, it is possible that Harvey will go down as one of the most expensive natural disasters, if not the most expensive, in American history. There have been some estimates that the damage will exceed that caused by Katrina and Sandy combined. And of course, dozens of Texans also lost their lives, the cost of which is incalculable. The FCC has a role to play in the federal government's efforts to address disasters like this. And working closely with the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, private communications providers, and others, the FCC monitors the status of communications networks in affected areas during times like this. And we have staffers on the ground who've done heroic work going into the eye of the storm, almost quite literally, to make sure that those critical links to the outside world are up and running. We provide information and data and support to first responders whenever possible, and we give special authority to government agencies and to private companies who need to use spectrum for relief and recovery efforts. A couple days ago, I had the chance to visit Houston, to see firsthand what challenges are remaining, and to get a better sense of the damage that was done and the heroic efforts to quickly restore communications. Among other things, I did an aerial tour of Harris County and the surrounding area, where I saw entire neighborhoods that were still underwater. I visited the Greater Harris County 911 Operations Center, where dispatchers whose own homes were flooded and who had nowhere else to go were working continuously through the storm and sleeping on the floor in the call center. And I went to the George R. Brown Convention Center, where I saw row after row after row of cots filled with families, some with very young children, who were accompanied with little more than the clothes on their back and all of the remaining possessions they had in their lives. And while I was in Houston, I personally saw the tremendous spirit of the people of Texas. In the face of this devastating storm, Texans didn't fold up and run for the hills, and they didn't falter. Instead, they bonded together, and they provided relief to their neighbors. Texans were compassionate, and they were tough, and I would say that they were an inspiration to this country. From the J.J. Watts to the Mattress Max to the millions of folks who just stepped up from near and far, we are grateful to all of them for what they've done. And I think they reminded us that the worst of tragedies in this country bring out the best in the American people. And so to all of them, I simply say, not so much as a regulator, but as a fellow American, thank you. Of course, as the recovery from Harvey continues here in Texas, the country is confronting a new threat in the form of Hurricane Irma. We at the FCC have been busy this week, and I've been particularly busy over the last several hours working with our federal partners to prepare for the storm, and our thoughts and our prayers and our actions go out to those in Irma's path. So, with that said, let's turn the page and talk about the internet. I saw something on Twitter the other day that I thought did a pretty good job of capturing the internet's place in our modern economy and society. And it wasn't some of the trolling tweets that I get. It was actually something more legitimate. Noah Smith, who is a columnist for Bloomberg View, tweeted the following, and I quote, "15 years ago, the internet was an escape from the real world. Now, the real world is an escape from the internet." And this tweet rings true to me, at least, for a reason. Because almost every facet of modern American life is going digital. How we work, how we stay in touch with friends and family, how we learn, how we play, how we entertain ourselves, how we stay healthy, how we engage politically, even the most human of interactions, how we meet a partner, increasingly happens with the help of digital tools. And so what does all this mean from a public policy perspective? Well, along with security, people primarily look to government leaders to help create the conditions that make it easier for the private sector to deliver economic growth, jobs, and personal opportunity. And to grow our economy, to create jobs, to advance economic opportunity in a world that's gone digital, we need world-leading internet infrastructure that serves as a platform for innovation and for entrepreneurship. And I think that a big reason why the United States leads the world still in broadband and so many other technologies is because we have infrastructure that has been created by the private sector. The 5 most valuable companies in the world are US firms. Every single one of them is founded by upstarts working out of a garage or a dorm room or something of the sort. But when I talk about how digital innovation is key to our economic future, it's important to remember that powerhouse companies in Silicon Valley or Seattle or places like that are just one part of the story. Since coming to the FCC in 2012, I've made a point of traveling to as many places as possible to get an up-close look at the connectivity challenges that local leaders are grappling with and the digital opportunities that they are creating. I've made it a point of primarily visiting people and places that few people associate with the digital revolution. Places like Wardensville, West Virginia, and Mission, South Dakota, and Carson City, Nevada, and even my hometown of Parsons, Kansas. Since becoming chairman this year, for example, I've logged over 3,000 miles in rental cars, hitting hotspots across the country. And I've got to say that my coworkers, bored as they have been by some of my banter, the topics of conversation get a little slim after 3,000 miles. It's been eye-opening for them and for me to be able to see people along the way. And at pretty much every stop, you see the same thing. You see mayors and you see police chiefs and school superintendents and just everyday citizens who are thinking creatively and hoping desperately to harness the power of broadband technology to make sure that their economic future for their hometowns will be as rich as their past. And there are a few other places in this country that I think have revitalized themselves as more vibrantly as a city I just visited 2 weeks ago, and that is Reno, Nevada. And before I went there, I will confess that the first thing that popped into my mind when I saw that Reno was on the calendar was Bill Murray and the bowling tournament at the end of the movie Kingpin. If you haven't seen it, highly rated, don't listen to Rotten Tomatoes, it should be at the top of your list. And not long ago, the Reno of Kingpin was looking like the glory days. Reno was hit worse than most by the Great Recession. In 2009, it was one of the country's foreclosure capitals. Unemployment spiked to 13.4% in 2010, which was 40% higher than the national average. Home values dropped to less than half of what they were in 2006. Now, Reno faced the reality that increased competition meant that gaming jobs would never return to previous levels. And so they had a decision to make, to double down on the model of the past or to explore a vision of the future. They chose the latter path. And so local authorities went all in on a strategy to lure technology companies. And that bet has paid off big time. The lineup of firms expanding operations in and around Reno reads like a who's who list of the technology world: Tesla and Google and Apple and Amazon. And the startup community is thriving too, with Reno emerging as a hub for drone technology and cloud computing services. And I still remember meeting a man named Gabe Hopper who works at a startup called Ustime. He and his wife wanted the lifestyle of a smaller community, so they moved from the Bay Area to Reno. And now he's working on an innovative startup that allows essentially parents and grandparents to communicate with young kids through video calling, and they can read books together in real time. An app that didn't exist before, a company that didn't exist previously, and a city, now Reno, which is benefiting from it. And so today, Reno's unemployment rate is below 4%. Manufacturing payrolls are up nearly 30% since 2012, and home values are higher now than they were before the crash. Now, Reno, as I said, has seen some success of late. Other places haven't been so lucky, and they remain on the wrong side of the digital divide. In Reno recently, I met with the superintendent of the Humboldt County School District, which is in northern Nevada near the Oregon border. And the superintendent oversees 11 schools, and he explained how students in this county's 5 rural schools, including some Native Americans at very, very small and remote schools, are falling behind their urban peers. They simply do not have the bandwidth that they need to take advantage of the latest digital learning tools. For too many of them, the cutting-edge technology remains the number 2 pencil. The day before that, I was in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I visited the Navajo Nation. Now, the Navajo Nation, if you don't know, faces a very high unemployment rate, and a lack of internet access there makes it hard for those who live there to search for jobs, or to pursue telework opportunities, or to get high-quality healthcare through telemedicine, or to educate their kids, to do so many of the things that we take for granted often in well-populated, better-off urban environments. Nationwide, 63% of people on rural and tribal lands lack access to fixed high-speed broadband. And overall, 28% of rural Americans couldn't sign up for broadband even if they wanted to. It just isn't there. So all of this raises the question, what should the FCC be doing to promote faster and better and ubiquitous internet access? Well, as I like to say, we have many tools in the toolbox to help expand digital opportunity for all Americans. The most powerful tool, in my view at least, is to establish rules that incentivize and maximize private investment in high-speed networks. The iron reality is this: broadband networks are very expensive to build, and they don't have to be built. Capital does not have to be spent in this industry. Risks don't have to be taken, and so the more difficult government makes it for companies to build a business case for deployment, the less likely it is that broadband providers, big and small, will invest the billions of dollars that are necessary to connect consumers with digital opportunity. And too often, unnecessary rules make it more expensive to construct these networks than it needs to be. In our Restoring Internet Freedom proceeding, the FCC is currently examining whether we should change our internet regulations in order to encourage greater deployment and more digital opportunity for all Americans. But it's important not to view that proceeding in isolation. Instead, it's just one part of a comprehensive review of how to encourage the construction of next-generation networks. We've also proposed to eliminate regulatory barriers to wireline and wireless infrastructure, such as rules that deter the transition from old and fading copper lines to modern fiber networks. By definition, every dollar that is spent maintaining the fading networks of yesterday is a dollar that cannot be spent building the networks of tomorrow. And so in my view, eliminating these barriers will mean more money that is spent building these networks of tomorrow, not maintaining those fading networks. We also want to lower the cost and increase the speed of deployment. And this is critical for the rollout of wireless networks in the future, what we call 5G. Now, 5G promises exponential growth in the Internet of Things. It could enable mobile broadband consumers to download 4K movies in seconds, which is quite useful for you Game of Thrones fans on the go. It could enable cooperative collision avoidance for cars. It could enable remote robotic surgery. And those are just a few of the applications that we can already foresee. If history is any guide, there are more transformative applications that we can only conceive of now. Just to give a sense of the timing, all of our major wireless carriers and equipment vendors, some of whom are in this room, are already conducting or plan to conduct 5G trials, including here in Dallas. And Ericsson predicts that a quarter of North American mobile subscriptions will be on 5G by 2022. This is all exciting stuff. But here's the critical thing about 5G. It will require massive investments in physical infrastructure. Most people, when they hear about wireless networks, think about the airwaves, but it's actually the physical guts of a network that are absolutely vital. For as we move to 5G, network architecture will shift from large macro cell towers, the big 100, 200-foot towers that we're used to seeing when we drive around, to densely deployed small cells, operating at lower power and often not visible unless you're specifically looking for it. And we're talking about hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of small cells deployed across the country. And those small cells are going to require backhaul. And backhaul, for those of you who don't have the misfortune of knowing, is the fiber and the other connections that carry traffic back into the core of the network. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, that is a lot of approvals that will have to be given. And that means a lot of possibilities for delays and for higher costs. The FCC, under my leadership, has begun to examine how state and local government processes can affect the speed and the cost of infrastructure deployment. And we're exploring reforms to those processes. We're also looking at ourselves, at our own rules and regulations to see how we can minimize costs and delays in order to expedite the 5G future. Now, here's the bottom line when it comes to this. That rules were designed years ago for 100-foot towers might not make sense for small cells that are often the size of a pizza box. Now, beyond these proposals that are already in motion, we have also established a Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, or BDAC. We specialize in the creation of acronyms, among other things, at the FCC. This BDAC is composed of experts who are focusing on the best ways to promote broadband deployment. And one of the group's key tasks is to draft a model code. That is a deployment-friendly set of rules that any town, any county, any jurisdiction can take off the shelf and use to deliver faster and cheaper and better internet access for its residents. Now, in addition to removing bureaucratic red tape, another powerful incentive for investment can be changes to the tax code. Returning to Reno, an important factor in luring so much investment from outside companies there is that there are no corporate or inventory taxes in Nevada. And we don't have the power at the FCC to do something about that, but those governmental entities that do have seen a return on that investment. Almost a year ago in Cincinnati, I proposed that Congress should provide tax incentives for ISPs to deploy high-speed broadband services in low-income neighborhoods. I saw that far too many Americans, especially in these low-income neighborhoods, were being left behind by the digital revolution. And I thought that Congress could do something to change that. I proposed that we call these gigabit opportunity zones. And my idea was to offer tax incentives as well to startups of all kinds to take advantage of those networks and to create jobs in these neighborhoods to try to revitalize a sense of community and a digital economy. And I'm pleased that members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, Senator Capito and Senator Coons in the United States Senate and Representative Collins of Georgia in the US House, have introduced the Gigabit Opportunity, or GO Act, which adopts many of the proposals I outlined last fall. And I'm hopeful that Congress, in a bipartisan way, will consider this legislation as part of any infrastructure plan they might consider. But we need a regulatory framework that not only maximizes investment, the incentives for investment, but also puts a priority on unleashing innovation. One of the things I find amazing about the age in which we live is that entrepreneurs are constantly developing new technologies and services. But too often they are unable to bring them to market at all or quickly enough for consumers because outdated rules and regulations or simply regulatory inertia stand in the way. And at the FCC, I've taken action to make sure that we are facilitating rather than frustrating innovation. For example, we want to encourage companies to innovate and to create new business models. And so I proposed in March that we breathe life into what's known as Section 7 of the Communications Act. Section 7, which has been on the books since 1984, requires the FCC to approve any application for a new technology or service or to act on that application within 1 year. It has literally never been enforced during 33 years on the books. It is being enforced now. Additionally, we want to encourage business model innovation and more options for consumers. And that's one reason why, earlier this year, we closed the FCC's investigation into free data offerings, what is known often as zero rating. It seems to me that wireless companies offering consumers something for free has proven to be pretty popular, shockingly, particularly among low-income Americans. and it's made the marketplace in the wireless world much more competitive. So going forward, the FCC will seek to promote, not to prevent, that kind of innovation. And we should also remember at this point that I think innovation is not just limited to the so-called edge of networks. Innovation also happens within the networks themselves, and it's critical, especially in the mobile space. To realize the 5G future, to realize some of this wireless innovation that we see around us, we need smart infrastructure, not dumb pipes. And we need rules that reflect this basic reality. So thus far, I've spoken about creating a regulatory framework that promotes private investment and innovation. And to do that, we have to make sure that the costs of our rules don't outweigh the benefits. This might seem like a radical proposition to few of you, but in Washington, that is pretty bold thinking. For too long, many have been concerned that the FCC has failed to meet that standard, and that it too often just failed to try. The FCC has a top team of really smart economists on staff, but their expertise is typically applied in an ad hoc fashion. They're sprinkled throughout the various bureaus and offices at the FCC, and their expertise isn't leveraged at all, or if it is leveraged, it's usually late in the game. Well, we are taking a major step to correct that. Early on in my tenure, I met with a variety of economists, and I told them that I wanted them to have a valued seat at the table. It is not just lawyers who should have a seat and should be driving the regulatory process. All expertise, all disciplines should be brought to bear on the critical questions that we face. And that's why this spring, I proposed to establish the Office of Economics and Data. Once created, this OED, with all apologies to you Oxford English Dictionary fans, will provide economic analysis for rulemakings, and it will also conduct longer-term research on ways to improve the Commission's policies. And I also want to foster an academic environment within the FCC for economic thinking. Some of the greatest breakthroughs that we've seen at the FCC over the last couple generations are the results of economists sitting down, thinking hard, and coming up with white papers. For example, spectrum auctions and price cap regulation and some of the other innovations are the result of really smart economists putting pen to paper, and then the lawyers and others at the agency putting paper into practice. Then the net result of all this, of this Office of Economics and Data, will be that economics and cost-benefit analysis in particular will become the norm at the FCC and not an afterthought. That's pretty much all the prepared material I've got, so let me just vamp for a second by quoting a Dallas entrepreneur who I think knows a little something about the digital economy, Mark Cuban. Back in 2014, Mark said, and I quote, "There is no better platform in the world to start a new business than the internet in the United States." And our goal at the FCC is to make sure that that will continue to be the case, and that that opportunity is extended to every single American, regardless of where he or she lives, regardless of how much money he or she makes, regardless of anything about his or her background. We want every American to have a chance at the digital age. And so our aspiration is to expand these networks and to unleash those digital opportunities for all Americans. And I believe that with the right rules, I think we can, and I know that we can, maximize investment and innovation throughout the internet economy. Thanks again to Tom for the invitation, to IPI for having me here, to all of you for not checking your Twitter feeds incessantly during my remarks. Look forward to a vigorous Q&A, and again, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to listen.